walk with him, so I might not see him step on him right now.
Hi, Whitney. How are you? Good.
Get started? All right. So Ezekiel chapter 8, turn there with me if you will. We're going to do Ezekiel's chapter 8 through 23 today. And the first few chapters we're going through are really a vision that God had given Ezekiel. And it's a pretty profound, pretty awesome picture. Not necessarily awesome in the positive sense of the word, but awesome as in powerful, profound, and impacting. So chapter 8, it really begins to show God supernaturally kind of takes, and I think the best way to describe it is God allows Ezekiel to see through tangible physical things spiritually what is happening in the temple. So Ezekiel, as we know, has already been taken into captivity, so he's in Babylon. He's not in Jerusalem, but what he describes is Jerusalem. And so he talks about the day that it happens, that the hand of the Lord God fell on me. I looked and behold, again, he describes what Kayleen drew last week, the melted metal and the fire, the bright view of like this light coming out of God. And verse 3 says, he stretched out the form of a hand and caught me by the lock of my head, and he lifted me up. So like he snatched him by the hair, basically. And so and then it says that he brought him to a place between earth and heaven. So again, it's this physical picture of real things and real people that he's seeing, but it certainly seems to be speaking to, it's a spiritual understanding, a spiritual picture of what's happening. And he does even mention some people by name. So maybe some of you guys have had dreams where God showed you something and it was real people, a real situation. A vision is like a dream. My understanding is really the only difference is a dream happens while you're asleep and a vision happens while you're awake, but it's the same thing. It's imagery that God shows us to teach or to explain something to us. But I wanted to leave some room on here because we've talked about the tabernacle so many times, but now, like once Jerusalem is settled and the temple is built, the temple is a little bit different than the tabernacle. So this is maybe kind of a simple way to describe it. So this is the tabernacle piece. So that's the Holy of Holies, the holy place in the outer courts as we knew it. But you see there's like another wall around the outside. So Solomon's temple, and then later, after they come out of captivity, Zerubbabel's temple, they call it, and then later in the time of Jesus, they call it Herod's temple. So each one of these is like a reconstruction, and each time it's expounded on, made bigger, more magnificent, more elements. The principles remain the same. But what they began to call this was the outer courts, and so this was like where tents used to be for the tabernacle, where people would live, kind of. This now was like a gathering place for people. So this would be like the city out here. This was like the gathering place for people. And then there was the inner courts, they called it. And this is like where the brazen altar and the brazen laver were. And then you still had the holy place. Rather than one golden lampstand, there was like 7 on each side. And so same principles and things applied, but there were some differences. And so then you had gates entering into the outer and the inner courts, north, south, and east entrances. And so in Ezekiel 8, it says, like, God brought me in through the northern entrance. And so that's part of what's different. Kind of one interesting piece of information. So we know that this temple is destroyed, basically in this time that we're reading now. God's people are taken into captivity. They come back. Zerubbabel, Ezra, Nehemiah, and that time they rebuild the temple. And then we know it's rebuilt again later by Herod. Again, same idea, even bigger. You can Google like the difference between the tabernacle and the top temple, or the Temple of Solomon, difference between Solomon and Herod. It's like humongous by the time that it's Herod, but the principles are the same across each one. But the only thing that remains now, because the temple was destroyed again about 100 or so years after the time of Jesus, or less than 100 years after the time of Jesus, you've heard of the Wailing Wall, or the Western Wall. That's this piece right here. That's all that remains, or that's part of that wall. There is all that remains. And so, like the actual temple, the surrounding walls, it's completely decimated. There's nothing remaining. That's the little piece that's left where the people put the prayers, like in the paper. It's this piece here. Can you have them with the sound on the thing? And so. This is an important picture because as they talk about it in Ezekiel, you're going to see kind of what they're referencing to. So Ezekiel chapter 8, God snatches Ezekiel up by the hair. He begins to show him this picture. And then he says, there's an idol right around here. It says kind of the northern wall. So some say it's there, but more likely it's kind of here in this place at the entrance, the northern, because remember we kicked out of the garden, you're coming back west towards God. So the northern entrance there. He says that there's an idol that's erected. There's an idol that's built up there. It's the idol of jealousy. Some different people have alluded to which idol this was. Some say Baal, some say Asthara or whatever. But there's different. But we know it's this idol of jealousy, and obviously part of this I think is kind of a play on words of like the jealousy of God against these idols. But again, remember. You have the brazen altar, the brazen laver here, and now you have an idol, like built up right there, like what other countries and people with their false gods, like right here in this area. This is what God is showing Ezekiel that's taking place there, and so he says, like, look, there's this idol that's here, an idol of jealousy at the entrance, and he says, verse 6, like, do you see what they're doing? What a great abomination this is supposed to be this holy place, and they're building idols. They're not even like subtle about what they're doing. And then he says, and then he brought me to the entrance of the court, and when I looked, behold, a hole in the wall. He said, see, son of man, now dig through the wall. And so now he's talking about kind of this area right here. So now he's like having Ezekiel dig through a hole into the holy place. And so in the holy place, we have the altar of showbread, we have the golden lampstand, or in this time, golden lampstands, the veil, the altar of incense. That's all in this area. In Ezekiel, like God shows him a hole to start digging through. Ezekiel digs through the hole. So again, physical imagery, but spiritual things that were being shown. And when Ezekiel comes through the door or through the hole, he looks into the holy place, and carved into the walls, because this is stone, not fabric, are like pictures of false gods, like prayers to false gods. And then there's all these elders, these leaders in this holy place, and all of them are like holding in their hands like trinkets of false gods. So they would have like wood or stone carving versions of different things. And so like this holy place that the Levitical priests are the only ones who are supposed to be there, and all that we talked about, that how important it is, and not until you're 30, and this was this sacred place that's filled with all these people that are holding, like they've carved it into the walls itself, and they're holding these idols. And basically what the people have done, and what God is accusing them of and showing Ezekiel that they did, is that like they have said, just our one God isn't enough. So we need to pray to this God of harvest, and this God of fertility, and this God of protection, and this God of whatever. And so they're trying to bring false gods in along with their God, which of course is just absolute wickedness. And verse 12 really says, well, then he said to me, son of man, do you see what the elders of the house of Israel are committing in the dark? Each man in the room of his carved images. For they say, the Lord does not see us. The Lord has forsaken the land. And so like there's this weird it's about them. And so since God wasn't enough and since God's not blessing us, they're unwilling to look at the fact that you're living in absolute wickedness. They're just saying God's not enough, and so we're bringing in these other gods along with. And then God shows Ezekiel another place, again, kind of in this general area, either here or here. It's these women who were sitting there weeping for Tammuz. And so again, this is another false idol. I believe this is the like fertility of land false god that because there's desolation in the land, rather than what's the thing, you live in sin, God sends a voice to say this is the wrong thing. You repent, really. You allow your life to change into the way that He's called you to live. He brings help and restoration. You walk back into... So this is still supposed to be what they're doing, but they're in sin and they have destruction all around them. And rather than saying, like, God, we've done what's wrong, they're turning to a false idol, and they're saying, oh, false God, why is our land not prosperous? And they're doing it right here in the temple of God. And then he says, do you see this? There's 25 men, and they're standing here. There's 25 people. And again, we're moving east to west, right? Because we're walking from sin, cast out of the garden, deception, separation from God, and we're coming back west towards the Lord. And it says that there's 25 men standing here. So in the inner courts, or what used to be called the outer courts in the tabernacle, and they have their back to the temple, and they're facing east, which is a picture of what? They're looking the wrong way, and they're looking to the sun, which again, false gods, the god of the sun, the god of the moon, and those things. And they are bowing to, they're prostrate, laying on their feet, worshiping, asking for help, giving honor to another false god right here at the front of the temple. Prostrating themselves eastwards, not westward, but toward the sun. And God again says to Ezekiel, do you see this? Do you see what these guys are doing, these abominations that they've done? And then I'm going to deal with them in wrath. And then in chapter 9, the vision for the punishment that's coming, God, and again, these are spiritual pictures, spiritual ideas, but basically these angels, or these beings that God called in, and He says, start here, and I'm going to have you look for what's right and for what's wrong, and those who are lamenting at the behavior that's taking place, the people that they're in this, but they hate it. They see what people are doing, but they hate what's happening. And He says, people like that, put a mark on their forehead. That these are people that, yes, they're here, but they don't like what's going on. Mark their forehead. Everyone who doesn't have a mark on their forehead, kill them. And start here. So the idea that there's wickedness here is crazy. Like, these are the people who are the priests unto God, like the ones that are really supposed to be walking right with and before Him. We just saw, like, there's worship of false idols. They have false idols in their hands and around their neck in the holy place, and like all these detestable things happening, and God brings in these heavenly soldiers essentially and says, now start here and then go through all of Jerusalem and destroy everyone without the mark on their head. And it says a little bit later in the chapter, in verse 8, where Ezekiel says, and I alone was left. Some interpret that to say that there was no one who had the mark. I don't think that's what it's saying. I believe what it's saying is there were so few, and where Ezekiel is here in the temple, there was like no holiness here. But there was such utter destruction, that there was such a massive percentage of population, so to speak, that was destroyed because so few were against what was happening that it blew Ezekiel away. Like he was just in complete shock. Like, is there anyone left? Like, is there going to be no remnant? Is it such a huge percentage of this population that's destroyed by this? And I mean, this is the state of where things are. Teresa.
Question. So in verse 8, it says God took him in the spirit. But in verse 9, is this physically happening?
No. So this is all
Okay.
spiritual vision, chapters 8, 9, 10, and 11. In the very end of chapter 11, the second to last verse, it says, and then the vision was over, and then God said, tell everybody what you saw. So, so then we go into chapter 10. Again, there's more that we could talk about, so much more, but for the sake of time, I want to kind of hit some of the major points. Then we go into chapter 10, and something like unthinkable basically happens. Chapter 10, God speaking to Ezekiel, and again we see the picture that Kayleen drew last week. You have the cherubim, you have the wheels, you have the expanse, and then you have the throne. God sitting upon the throne, and something is beginning to happen. And part of what God asks him to do is, so you have these soldiers that are destroying. You'll see kind of back and forth throughout this. Well, in the next chapter too, there's the sword, and then there's like the fire. So there's the destruction. And so one of these angelic creatures that are destroying, there's one that's kind of singled out. Remember where the fire and lightning was going back and forth between the wheels and the cherubim? Like reach into that, grab that fire, and then bring the fire to Jerusalem. So not just slaughter, but like the fire of destruction is going to come as well. And we'll actually read a little bit later that this is imagery speaking to something that God is doing. But then again, it talks about like what the cherubim and everything look like. It's interesting. There's a little bit of a difference this time. In verse 12 of chapter 10, it says, their whole body, their backs, their hands, their wings, and the wheels were all full of eyes. So instead of just the wheels, now all of them are. And then it's not, I don't know that it's terribly important, but in verse 14, it describes the four faces again, but it doesn't mention the ox. It says the face of a cherub, but the word cherub is typically meant to be ox. And so in our understanding of what cherubim are, and again, remember they had the hooved feet, like some sort of big, strong creature was the imagery that people typically saw. Again, when you think of the cherubim guarding the eastern gate, don't think, the white robe dude with the big wings. Maybe think like an ox with big wings, and you know what I mean? Like that's more the imagery when we think of cherubim that the Bible describes. But then in verse 18, this is the unthinkable that happens. So we know what's taking place here, but what's always coming out of the Holy of Holies, right? The fire, the pillar, the presence of God is here. It says in chapter 10, verse 18, that God on his throne, on the cherubim, lifts and leaves. He leaves his temple behind. And so the presence of God is no longer in the temple. Now, this is really powerful, interesting, terrifying, sad for a couple different reasons. The fact that God is leaving his temple alone, man, that's a big deal. I mean, I think for today, is it possible to have a church service that God has no part in? Yeah. Like, is it possible to claim to be a Christian when God has no residence inside that person? Yeah. I think, but also part of this is up to this point, even with false idols erected and priests with, small carved idols in their hands and around their necks, God stayed. After the northern kingdom had been destroyed years before, and after the southern kingdom saw it and continued on in their wickedness, God stayed. It was only after all of this that God finally, his presence departed from his temple, which again shows so much, but part of it that we see in this is horrifying as a picture as this may be, is we see the loving endurance and patience of God for his people. And then in chapter 11, we see, again, the indictment on the leaders that are there. And again, this language of an enemy in my hand, a tool in my hand. We kind of start to see this here, that the picture of the destruction that's coming is Babylon that's going to come in and destroy this, and the reason why. is because of these wicked leaders. Verse 2, these are men who devise iniquity and give evil advice to the city. They're prophesying and they're saying things like, the time is not near. So, everything's fine, and what we're doing is good, and they're prophesying and speaking and telling people and giving advice that's not true. Again, today, just because someone shares a message like you're doing great and you're doing good and so everything's fine, doesn't mean it's true. God, I feel like for me, especially in this season, God is really talking to me about the importance of understanding that in the presence of God there is fullness of joy. That joy is such a big part of who God is. But sometimes we just call happiness and complacency and apathy, we call it joy. And it's not the same thing. And so we're not supposed to walk around somber and sad. Like, God wants us to have a fullness of joy. And I know it's an area He's growing me in. But there's a real joy and there is a false substitute, which really could be more like apathy. And so these guys are proclaiming and leading and saying, everything's fine. Like, smile and relax and let your guard down. Everything's going to be okay, even though literally they're rotting from the inside out, from the leadership down. All of this is what's taking place. And so God is saying, I'm going to bring you out, and you're going to be destroyed. That you haven't. Verse 12, you have not walked in my statutes, nor have you executed my ordinances, but you've acted according to the ordinances of the nations around you. So again, the influence of these other countries and their false gods have not just been allowed to exist, but now they're all the way into the temple itself. But then again, the goodness of God, verse 14, even though all of this is true, though I have removed them far away. Verse 16, verse 17, he says, I will gather you from the peoples and assemble you out of the countries among which you have been scattered, and I will give you the land of Israel. So even before they've been fully exiled, with the last bit of them fall, God is saying, yes, I'm going to tear you out of this place, but a day is coming where I'm going to restore. And I believe, and I think that we can see there's kind of dual imagery here. That yes, the people are going to be let out of Babylon. Yes, they're going to come back to Jerusalem. Yes, they're going to rebuild the Zerubbabel and Ezra and Nehemiah. By the time Jesus comes, the temple has been rebuilt to even greater wonder than it was then. But it also is the promise that God was speaking all the way back to Moses and before, that these people had hearts of stone, and I'm going to do a work, it says in verse 19, a heart of stone for a heart of flesh. And so I believe this is also imagery speaking to the church today. The finished work, when Jesus comes, and imagery speaking to the new heaven and the new earth when all is completely restored. And again, verse 20, they will walk in my statutes. They will keep my ordinances, and they'll do them. They will be my people, and I will be their God. And then verse 24, Ezekiel says, and the Spirit lifted me up and brought me into a vision by the Spirit of God to the exiles in Chaldea, Babylon. So the vision that I had seen left me. And then I told the exiles all that the Lord had shown me. And so a lot in this vision, a lot in all of what's going on here. And then in chapter 12. So any comments or questions before we move on to the next chapter? Okay. So chapter 12, now he is no longer in the vision. Again, he didn't actually go to Jerusalem per se. It was a spiritual thing that he was experiencing, that God was showing was very real. But he's still in exile. And so now he's around these people. There's some left in Jerusalem, and we know how they're doing. But there's some who have already been brought into captivity, like Daniel, like Ezekiel, who are there. And so God is kind of talking through Ezekiel, and he will, through some of the other voices that we'll read in some of the weeks to come, about what does it look like to be here? What does it look like to live here? And so a lot of this is kind of rebuke language, like you have been people who have eyes but you're not seeing, you have ears but you're not hearing, that you've been rebellious. And so God has Ezekiel kind of act out again like the brick with Jerusalem and the little town. He says, I want you to get your luggage, like your baggage, and I want you to every day show people that you're gonna try to go somewhere with your baggage, and then like dig through this hole in this wall and like sneak through the wall and just do it over and over and over again and have everybody watch. So again, God is asking Ezekiel to do something relatively strange as a message for people. So do you feel the pain or the pressure perhaps that Ezekiel feels? And so I just encourage you, when God says there's a word that he asked me to share, or there's a thing he's asking me to step out and do, and it feels odd, or maybe it feels like it'll be a little bit embarrassing or scary, he's not asked you, I imagine, to every morning walk through downtown Olympia covered in baggage, and then to find a wall and carve a hole through it and crawl through it as people stare at you like there's something terribly wrong with you. But this is what God had Ezekiel do. So he does this over and over and over again. And this is basically the picture. There's more to it than this that he's showing. The people who are in Jerusalem, or the people maybe even here, who would think that you can gather all your things together, and because you would do this at night, and sneak out at the night with your belongings, and you sneak through the wall, whether it be escaping as Babylon's coming to destroy the last of Jerusalem, or you're here sneaking through the wall trying to get out of Babylon. God says, I myself will put a net over you, and I'll ensnare you. So the message essentially is this. God is saying what you're experiencing, the exile that you're in, is not because of Babylon. It's because of me. And so you maybe could sneak away from Babylon, but Babylon's not the one keeping you here. I am. So if you sneak out, I'll catch you. Like I'll ensnare you, and I'll bring you back in. So this is, again, we're towards the beginning of Ezekiel's ministry, but you just sense the seriousness of the tone that God is asking him to speak, and the challenge that must be for him to share words like this. Hey guys, we're here, not because God's not good, not because Babylon's so evil, but because we're so evil, because we have been so wicked. That's why we're here. That would be a tough pill to swallow, so to speak, right? Then in chapter 13, we hear a familiar message that we've heard a lot of times, speaking against these false leaders, these false prophets. And so again, God says to Ezekiel, prophesy against these prophets of Israel, who prophesy to say to those, they've been prophesying from their own inspiration. They're saying, thus saith the Lord, God said nothing. They're sharing pictures and images that they're seeing, but God didn't give them to them. They're presenting messages to people to influence and share a message, but it's not a message from God. And so, verse 6, they see falsehood and lying divination, who are saying the Lord declares when the Lord has not sent them, yet they hope for the fulfillment of their word. So basically, because they're saying something in, again, to use modern day, they say like, thus saith the Lord, he wants you to know that prosperity and good things and open doors and things are coming for you. And it sounds like something that God would say, or it sounds like things that other prophets have spoken, but it's not God. And your hope that it came in the context and from a person like God had spoken through in the past, don't put your hope there. It doesn't matter how much it looks like or sounds like something that you've attributed to be true. If it's not from me, don't put your hope in it, because there's no power in it, because the power is not in how it's presented or the title of the person who presents it. It's whether or not God actually said it. And so again, God has Ezekiel do these different things. He's telling him, look, I'm against you because of what you're doing. There's no place for them. There's no place for them in the council of my people. They're declaring peace, peace, when there is no peace. I mean, look around you. There's no peace. The fact that they're saying it shows how wrong they are. And then God has Ezekiel, set your face against the daughters of your people who are prophesying for their own inspiration. Prophesy against them as well. So not only is Ezekiel speaking against the prophets who are giving, churchy prophetic words but aren't from God, there's also this other group of people, this group of prophetic women who, and you can really see it's a mixture of like what you would say with prophetic things of God, but it's also a mixture of things that the false idols and false gods and false religions had them do, where there was bracelets and gems and things that they were wearing and they're saying like, this is God. They're using God's name, and if you wear this bracelet, you'll have this protection or this good thing. And honestly, in so many ways, it reminds me of a lot of the kind of New Age Christianity that you see a lot now, of like, you incorporate, yoga with Christianity, or you incorporate like these chants that you do with Christianity. It's not God. Like, it's not him at all. They might use Bible verses, and they might, say Jesus and add these pieces. It's the same thing as these women were doing here, is they're selling these bracelets and giving people this false sense of hope that God is speaking, but that's not what's happening. This is, like he's saying, speak against them. At verse 20, I am against your magic bands. Like, I will tear them from your arms. And I, even those who, that you'll be hunted as birds. And so just this awful stuff that's happening. And so this is what's made its way into the exile area, where you still have these people prophesying in exile, peace is coming, even though it's not true. And you have these practices of wickedness intermixed with truth that are still happening. And God is saying, speak against them and speak against them. And you can see this is good. This is good because God is asking Ezekiel to speak against not only wickedness, but speak against those places between obvious wickedness and obvious good, the false claims, the between the 2 points claims. And so what's the verse, like a version of godliness, but it's not actual godliness. It's a version of righteousness, but it's not really. And so that's what God is having Ezekiel speak against. And then in chapter 14, same idea here. There's these idolatrous elders. I, the Lord, will be brought to give him an answer in the matter in view of the multitude of his idols. That there's all these idols that have been brought in. Again, the picture we saw in Ezekiel earlier in the tabernacle or in the temple, like they've brought these idols here. These people who are supposed to be leaders, these people who are supposed to be, trustworthy, because of their wickedness, like just great punishment is coming. And then something really fascinating happens in chapter 14, is there's 4 different types of destruction that God speaks to. And there's something powerful that's being said here that I think if we could potentially misinterpret it. Because God mentions through Ezekiel 3 names of righteous people. And it's Noah, it's Daniel, and it's Job. What's interesting about Noah, Daniel, and Job? About the context of where they stood? Can anybody see like maybe a similarity between those 3? Everything sucked and everyone around them died. That's a good way of putting it. What else?
Wickedness.
Yeah, there was great wickedness going on. So Job, like, that's kind of during a really mysterious time. We don't know what's going on, but great destruction happened to him. Satan was able to destroy like his family, and all his friends had terrible advice. His wife told him to die, and so not a good season for him. And then we have Noah, where God's telling him to build a boat, and what does everyone around him say? Like, you're crazy. There's something wrong with you. And then Daniel. This is during this time, so older names that they would have known, but also a modern name that they would know, where he is being righteous in the midst of Babylon, like in the midst of wickedness and these things that are happening. And so, but this is the picture that's being said. Your hope is in these figures. And he's not talking about these 3 per se, but it's like in these elders and these leaders and these prophets and these women making bracelets and these people proclaiming peace. And now he's getting into, and these elders that, if you could just get them to say something good to you, if you could just trust in them, like you're putting your hope in these people, thinking as long as I'm like blessed by them, accepted by them, in their counsel, in their care, I'm going to be okay. And God says through Ezekiel, if Job himself, if Noah himself, if Daniel himself stood in the midst of where either famine, sword, plague, or beasts come in to destroy, hope in them alone will save none. Like they couldn't even save their kids. Like their righteousness, if it wasn't their kids' righteousness, it wouldn't be enough. It would save them alone. So putting your hope in that, like, I'm attached to these people will make me okay, pick the most righteous people who stood in the midst of adversity, you wouldn't be safe just by knowing them. Like, you wouldn't be safe in their shadow. Their righteousness would save them alone. And so there's this beautiful tearing that's taking place of you stand before God. You don't stand through someone before God. It's not, I'm a part of this lineage. I'm a part of this family, because we're the chosen people of God, or I'm a descendant of Reuben or whatever. And so therefore and he's saying, look, your attachment to people thinking that somehow that's okay, pick the best ones. It wouldn't help you. And he even says, look, if their daughters and sons were like you, it wouldn't save them either. And so a powerful message that's being shared here, that the vengeance of God, the wrath of God that's coming against wickedness, these Yehus you're following, they're nothing like Noah, Job, and Daniel. But even if they were Noah, Job, and Daniel themselves, it wouldn't be enough. And so almost like terrifying idea, but so extreme that it's getting people's attention, beginning to make a point and to make an argument that people could use.
Well, can I say something?
Please.
Well, and it's cool because Noah, Daniel, and Job, their actions and their obedience and their prayers, especially Daniel and Job, like they stood for other people. Noah saved his family because of obedience. Daniel saved like a great many people because of his obedience. Job prayed forgiveness for his children. Like they all stood for their families and for those around them.
Yeah.
So these were very specific people that were chosen for God to say this. It's really cool.
Yeah.
I think it's crazy too how you see the pattern even later on repeated during Jesus' time, where he's like, our father Abraham, like he's like, don't put your confidence there.
Yeah.
And so they're making the same mistake, basically like, yeah, this is the line that we're of, like we're God's people.
Right.
And literally
He said, yes, look at Abraham. And why was Abraham righteous?
Yeah.
Because he put all his hope and his trust in God.
Yeah.
So be like Abraham. Put all your hope and trust in God. Don't say, I'm related to him. Like, that doesn't help you. Like, you're wicked. Like, that's the point. And so the same message is being shared here. It's a really good distinction, Tim. So chapter 15, it's kind of a short and interesting chapter, but basically the point that it's making is, have you guys ever seen like a grapevine of some sort, where where the trunk of the vine comes up can be here, but where the vines go could be super, super far away. But the wood of a vine, of a grapevine, it's like a bunch of small vines and things intertwined. It is not useful wood to build. It is not. You don't make planks out of grapevine wood. The best that you can do for it is chop it up and burn it. And so that's basically what chapter 15 is saying. Is like, you're putting your hope in a thing that isn't to be hoped in. Something that you're saying, I'm going to build with this. You can't build with that. We're going to use the lumber from this vine. You don't use vine lumber. Like, that's not a thing. All that it's good for is to be burned up. And there's really cool imagery that's in that. But that's the gist of chapter 15. And then chapter 16 is, in my mind, probably one of the most heartbreaking chapters in the Bible. I would encourage you, if you didn't get a chance to read, go back and read this chapter and really take some time to allow the Lord to just to talk to you through it. And I think, again, it really ties into the season we're in, the day that we're in, the things that are happening in our country and our world. But I will try to summarize the best I can for the sake of our time that we have together. But this is the gist of it. God speaks of his people, and he talks about all that he did for them. He says, when I found you, you were like a baby in like a desert with no hope, with no help, with no life, and no chance of anything good happening to you. And then he says, I did all these things for you. I brought you into my care. I washed you. I bathed you with water. I washed off the blood. The image that's used is like a baby that's just born. The umbilical cord hasn't even been cut. You're not washed. You're not clothed. You're not. Part of what they would do is they would rub salt on the skin and things like that. And so, like, none of those things that you're supposed to do for a baby have been done for you. Like, just still bloodied and unwashed, like you're just tossed on the ground. That's where I found you. I came, I washed you, washed off the blood, and I anointed you with oil. So if in light of the tabernacle conversations and things we've had, we get the imagery that's connected here: water, blood, and anointing. This is the laver, right? Like this is, so there's a spiritual element that's happening, the new life of a new believer in Christianity. We're covered in the blood of Jesus, not the blood of our sin, to our death, but to his death. We're washed in baptism, washed clean. We're anointed to walk into the work. So this imagery is not accidental, and the new birth picture, really ties all of this in together. But he's saying, look, I did all of this for you. He says, and then I clothed you. And he's like, I gave you these beautiful clothes. I put these really nice sandals on your feet. And then more than just clothing, I wrapped you with fine linen, and then I covered you with silk. So he's saying, I didn't just practically give you something to wear. I gave you something beautiful to wear. And then over the top, so like if you can imagine, like you have like a burlap sack, like that's maybe like an undergarment. He's like, yes, I clothed you, but not just clothed you. I fine linen. So like the stuff that the temple is made of. Like I put these beautiful fine, so that's what your clothes are made of. And then he adorned you with silk. So you don't need a silk scarf over your clothes, but I love you so much, I wanted to give you this. So he says, I gave you this silk. And then more than that, I put these beautiful ornaments on you of nose rings and bracelets and earrings and necklaces and rings and like all these, and then a crown on your head. I took a bloodied, ignored, destined for death baby in the desert, and I grew you into something, and I clothed you with the finest of things. Now he's talking about his people, the Israelites, but he's also talking about people, like an Israelite. And again, I think it's important for us, he's talking about us, the people of God. Like all of this imagery matters. And this is what's heartbreaking, is most of the rest of this chapter, he says, you took the clothes, the washing, the crown, the ring, the silk, the linen, and he goes one by one, and you used it to sell yourself as a harlot. You took that silk that I gave you and you sold it, and you gave yourself to harlotry, that crown, the nose, like every piece of what God gave them to bless them, every piece of what God gave them to set them apart, that they would be seen as this beautifully adorned, this beautifully loved bride. You took what I gave you and you turned it in the worst way to sell yourself to all these nations and false gods and these people. Verses basically 13 through 32 is in the same type of detail. It's undressing all of the dressing that God had done. And how each piece was like, you took this good thing I gave you and you squandered it and you turned it into this. You took this beautiful thing I gave you and you squandered it and you went after this. And again, Ezekiel used so much of the harlotry, the prostitute language that when he's talking about his people, and he's talking about the Philistines and the Assyrians and the Egyptians, and so he's using very specific, very in some ways relatively recent history of when you look to them to help you in this situation. That's like taking this bracelet that I gave you and doing this with it. And so it's this beautiful picture of the dressing above and beyond that God did for his people, and this heartbreaking picture of the undressing and the corrosion and the wickedness and the harlotry, that the very same elements that he gave are used in reverse. And then verse 32, he says, you adulterous wife who takes strangers instead of her husband. And then verse 33 is really powerful. Men give gifts to all harlots. So he's saying, men who sleep with prostitutes, pay them. But you give your gifts to all your lovers to bribe them to come to you in every direction for your harlotries. He's saying men pay women to sleep with prostitutes, pay prostitutes to sleep with them. You're a prostitute and you're paying men to sleep with you. Like, you're so twisted in your thinking. Like, and this is the picture of God's people. And we've seen, all of the imagery and everything that points to it. But this is the same thing. The New Testament talks about the same way, about what people do with their freedom, what people do with their forgiveness, what people do. And so when you talk to someone and they're like, oh, once saved, always saved. I can do whatever I want. I gave my life to Jesus. I can live however I want. Or I'm living in freedom. I don't get bound down by sin. So I do what I want. I don't walk with condemnation. And so I'm able to party and sleep around and do these things because you know what, God, Jesus he's a God of love and he meets me where I'm at. And he spent time with prostitutes and he spent time with tax collectors and these people. And so who are you to judge me? It's the same thing as this. Is they're taking the very gifts that God had made to adorn his church, to adorn his people, and they're turning them around and they're selling them to sell themselves. They're selling the gifts that God had given them to sell themselves. It's just, it is heartbreaking.
And can we read 14 and 15 real quick?
Yeah.
It's just like, it's like what you just described, but it's just such a powerful 2 verses. After he dressed them, it says, and your renown went forth among the nations because of your beauty. For it was perfect through the splendor that I had bestowed on you, declares the Lord God. But you trusted in your beauty and played the whore because of your renown and lavished your whorings on any passbyers. Your beauty became his. And it's like, she was beautiful because not of anything of herself, but because of what him upon her, what he lavished upon her. And then she began to trust in it as though it was her own.
That was the point.
And it's like, I feel like it sums up so much of what you beautifully explained. It's like, it's just such an amazing...
Their beauty, again, back to Abraham. Why was God making a people? To be a message to the world.
Yeah.
So he made this beautiful people, adorn them, so that the world would be like, wow, that's what their God does for their people. And so instead of saying, this is what my God does for his people, serve my God, they said, hey, I'm really beautiful. I can use this to my advantage. And they sold themselves. And so the opposite of what they were meant to do.
Which was the exact thing God was saving them from.
Right.
I mean, just culturally, this picture, even say back then, there are countries now that this is like, you could do this picture in other countries too, but like back then, like the value of like an abandoned girl. And it's somebody came, like he's the Redeemer,
Right.
like he redeemed her and spared her from a life she never had to live. And here, once he redeemed her and her beauty was renowned and it was his beauty in her, because he spared her from a life she never had to live, and she goes and chooses that life anyway. It's just crazy. Like this is a very good example. And
I'm telling you,
Yeah.
it's a hard to read chapter, honestly.
it is.
But there is so much that God has to say through this chapter, and not just for a long time ago, but for today, and in our own lives. Verse 39. It kind of brings to the end of this conversation. And he says, these people that you've sold yourself to, I will give you into their hands, into the hands of your lovers, and they will tear you down from your shrines, demolish your high places, strip you of your clothing, take away your jewels, and leave you naked and bare. So basically, these people that you've put your trust in, I'm going to let them take what you're giving them. And you're going to end up bloodied, on the ground, in the desert, naked, just like I found you. And then verse 42. But I will calm my fury against you, and my jealousy will depart from you, and I will be pacified and angry no more. So even though all of this took place, even though this is how they responded, God again shows. But after this, I will come back to you again, find you bloodied, left in the desert, naked, and I'll meet you again. It's fascinating. Just the goodness of God. anyhow, I mean, there's more to it, and then verse 60 where he talks about, I will remember my covenant with you in the days of your youth and establish an everlasting covenant with you. Again, speaking to the return of Israel, yes, but also the church today, yes, and then again the ultimate church in the future. Then you will remember your ways and be ashamed when you receive your sisters, both your older and your younger, and I will give them to you as daughters, but not because of your covenant. I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall know that I am the Lord. And so basically God's saying, even though this is where we are, even though this is what you've done, can you imagine you give a gift to someone, say an engagement ring, and you give this beautiful jewel to someone that you love, and they melt down the ring and sell the diamond in order to pay for like a weekend away with someone they're cheating on you with. Like, that's the picture. Like, and he's saying, even though you did that, like, I'm going to bring you back, and I'm going to enter back into covenant with you. Like, this is the heart of God, which is our whole life. We can begin to understand more and more of him and not find the end. So anyhow, I know it's kind of heavy and it's a lot, but it's important. And I again, like I said, I encourage you to go back and read it, reread it, and just see the imagery and the things that God might bring to you. Chapter 17, the first 10 verses is just kind of this image of an eagle taking off a piece of a branch and dropping it, and roots coming in and water, and it's very confusing. And then verse 11, it explains basically what's happening. And so it's speaking to the picture of Babylon coming in, taking over Israel, the punishment for what they did, again, not hope in royal families, not hope in where you come from, but God's the one that does what he's going to do, and he's the one that's going to respond in the way that he wants to respond. And again, like, if you put your hope in Pharaoh, Pharaoh can't help you. If you put your hope in Assyria, Assyria can't help you. If you put your hope in Babylon, Babylon can't help you. That God is more than all of this. And then again, in chapter 18, there's the Job, Daniel, Noah. It's for you. Chapter 18 really kind of comes back to this, that God is dealing with individual people, yes, as a nation, but also as the individual, because of the things that they're doing. And it's again really a powerful picture to the graciousness and the mercy of God, because this is kind of the picture that people are arguing, like, God, are you fair or are you not fair? And God essentially says through Ezekiel, he goes, look, I don't want wicked to perish. I gain no joy from that. He says, I gain joy when a wicked person hears a word from a guy like Ezekiel or whomever, and they say, my God, I'm living in wickedness. I no longer want to. They turn from their wickedness. They walk into righteousness. God says, that's what I enjoy. And so you're saying there's something wrong with my judgment because these people that you said were righteous, who are now living in wickedness, that it's wrong that I judge them. So they're mad at God that they're in exile. God's saying, you're in exile because you're wicked. And you're saying, there's something wrong with me and that's why you're here. He's saying, you don't understand. If you started out wicked and turned towards righteousness, I would reward you. But you came from righteous people, but you've walked in wickedness, so there's punishment for you. And guess what? If now you would understand that you're living in wickedness and turn to righteousness, I would reward you. And so it's this, you have this woe is me and what's wrong with God and why are you being so mean and why are you treating us this way and what did we ever do to you? He's like, look in the mirror. You're wicked. This is the end of wickedness. It ends in destruction. It ends in death. And you're saying that, like, why am I being good to them? I'm good to everyone who turns from wickedness. And if you wanted to do that, which I hope you do, because I get no joy in wicked meeting their end, and don't put your hope in I used to be righteous. I mean, there's a lot of language in this chapter that's saying that your righteous deeds, if you live in wickedness, are going to be burnt up. Like, you can't just hope in what you did. It's in how you're living. It's really, really profound verses 26 and 27. When a righteous man turns away from his righteousness, commits iniquity, and dies because of it, for his iniquity which he has committed, he will die. Again, when a wicked man turns away from his wickedness, which he has committed, and practices justice and righteousness, he will save his life. So there's blessing that comes with walking in the ways of God. And then in chapter 19, this is, for the sake of time, this is just a lament, like the book of Lamentations. It's just saying, in light of the fact that it's poetry. It's a song. It's this song of lament saying, like, how sad it is that we are where we are because of these things that have happened. Great devastation has come upon us, and it's beautiful imagery and words to describe the sadness of and the reality of what's going on to the people of God. Then in chapter 20, this is where God's response to Israel's life, God's response to Israel's choices, like in a bunch of different ways, in a bunch of different areas. They've trusted in Babylon, they've trusted in Egypt, they've trusted in Assyria, they've trusted in false gods rather than following Him. They've rebelled against God. They have done what they weren't supposed to do. They have lived in the way that they're not supposed to live, like we've talked about so many times. I brought them into this land that they didn't earn. They crossed the Jordan because I parted it. They left Egypt because I parted the Red Sea. It wasn't their strength over Pharaoh. It was my strength over Pharaoh. I'm the one that sustained them in the desert. I'm the one that brought Jericho down. Like, I did this for you, and you turn your back on me. And so I have withdrawn my hand of blessing. I've withdrawn my hand of protection. And I'm sending in now, a tool in my hand, Babylon, to scatter you. Again, you're supposed to be a picture of an image of the goodness of God and the righteousness of God, and you're not. So I'm not going to let you keep that land. I'm not going to let you keep that temple. I'm not going to let you send the message that that's who I am, because it's not. And so I have pronounced them unclean. I have said that these are not my people. This is not, they've blasphemed against me. They've trusted in false idols and these things. And so, you've given yourself over to the harlot, and so destruction is coming to you. But then again, the goodness of God, verse 33. But I'm going to remember. I'm going to restore. I'm going to bring you back. I'm going to make things right. And then in chapter 21 and 22, or 21, the first and second part of 21, that same imagery of the guys, the angelic beings that destroyed all of Jerusalem and the fire that was pulled from between the cherubim, we see that imagery continued here, where a sword is coming to destroy, and it says that the sword is both sharpened and polished. And the sharpened is to be able to strike, with deadly force. And the polished is like flashes of lightning, or fire coming off of this sword. And this is, again, an instrument of God's judgment. Because of what you've done, because of how you've lived, judgment is coming against you. And so, again, this is God speaking through Ezekiel. Tell them, like, this is me. This is my sword. This is my sharpened sword. This is my polished sword that's coming against you. And judgment's coming. I'm going to pour out my indignation on you, and I will blow on you with the fire of my wrath. I will give you into the hand of brutal men skilled at destruction. Speaking of Babylon. And then in chapter 22, God speaks through Ezekiel again. And so this is kind of finishing the last piece of this language and conversation. Verse 26, I think is a great verse to remember. Her priests have done violence to my law, and they've profaned my holy things. They have made no distinction between the holy and the profane, and they have not taught the difference between the unclean and the clean, and they hide their eyes from my Sabbaths, and I am profaned among them. Her princes with her are like wolves tearing the prey by shedding blood and destroying lives in order to get dishonest gain. Her prophets had smeared whitewash for them, seeing false visions and divining lies for them, saying, Thus says the Lord God, when the Lord has not spoken. The people of the land have practiced oppression and committed robbery. They have wronged the poor and needy and have oppressed the sojourner without justice. So this is like your leaders, your priests, your princes, and the people. You're just the worst. Like you're doing everything wrong. And then a terrifying indictment, verse 30. I searched for a man among them who would build up the walls and stand in the gap before me for the land so that I would not destroy it. But I found no one. Thus I have poured out my indignation on them. I have consumed them with the fire of my wrath, and their way I have brought upon their heads, declares the Lord God. And then chapter 23 is really kind of a fascinating parable, maybe for lack of better language, about these two women, Oholah and Oholibah. And they are, it says pretty early on in the chapter that Samaria is Oholah and Jerusalem is Oholibah. And this is the basic picture or the story that it tells. It's pretty fascinating. It's using, again, the same harlotry imagery that's used before. And he's saying there's these two women who were in Egypt, and I called them out, and they were beautiful virgins that were called out, Samaria and Jerusalem. And so remember, that's the northern and the southern kingdom that we had. And it says the Samaria daughter, she gave herself to harlotry, she sold herself to the people around her, and she lived wickedly, and she was destroyed. And so it's a relatively short story about Samaria, which in the timeline of what we've read, that's true. Samaria fell way earlier than Jerusalem did. But this is what's interesting, because you remember at the beginning when we first started talking about there was the southern kingdom, Judah, who was kind of still living in righteousness, and they were speaking against the northern kingdom that was giving in to the Assyrians and all the surrounding nations, and they were putting their hope in that. After that moment, it says, even though Jerusalem, Oholibah, saw her sister and her wickedness and the punishment and the result of her wickedness and sin, they did all that she did and so much more. As wicked as the northern kingdom was, the southern kingdom was far more wicked. Even though they had the example, because think about this, Judah, Jerusalem, like just down the road, has a living example of the burning remains of the other half of their people always before them. And they continued down the exact same path, doing the same thing against them. And so in the same way, the people that you put your trust in, the people that you sold yourself to, I'm going to give you over to them. And they will come against you with weapons, chariots, and wagons, and with companies of people, and they'll set themselves against you on every side, and they're going to destroy you. And I will set my jealousy against you, that they may deal with you in wrath. They will remove your nose and your ears, and your survivors will fall by the sword. They will take your sons and your daughters, and your survivors will be consumed by the fire. They will deal with you in hatred, take all your property, and leave you naked and bare. Again, that same language that you knew better. You had an opportunity to see what happens, and you didn't even slow down. You got worse, even though you saw this. The cups of horror and desolation, cups of, the same type that your sister Samaria drank from. You're going to drink from all that Samaria drank from, all the desolation and destruction that she experienced. You're going to drink every bit as much. As a matter of fact, you're going to drink all that she drank, and you're going to eat the cup. Like that's what's going to happen to you. And for where they have slaughtered their children for their idols. So this is 39, I feel like, and again, we're kind of out of time, and so I want to wrap up. But chapter 23, verse 39 gives the picture of because sometimes you can get lost in the wrath of God, and you don't understand the goodness of God. But verse 39 says, for when they had slaughtered their children for their idols, then entered my sanctuary on the same day to profane it, and lo, thus they did within my house. God is saying, look, these people were so wicked. They would take their son or their daughter, and they would kill them, child sacrifice, to some false idol, and then walk into my tabernacle, my temple, like to try to pay some sort of homage to me after they had just done that. Like I'm going to allow that. Like I would hear any prayer from someone who just killed their own kid for me. Or to some false idol come and try to talk to me about, like, what do I need to do for you? So this wickedness had gone so far. I mean, this practice that these people were living by was so far from God. He's like, this is who they were. And so that's why destruction has come. That's why Jerusalem is fixing to fall. And that's why you're in exile. And that's what's happening now. And so that's Ezekiel chapters 8 through 23. Any thoughts or questions to add, guys, to all of this pretty sobering stuff? Yeah, hard one to talk about. All right, guys. So next week, here's what we're going to do is Jeremiah 21 through 45. Jeremiah 21 through 45. And then we've got, I think, 3 more weeks after that. And then we're done through Malachi. So we're coming to an end. So Jeremiah 21 through 45. Thanks, guys.